A few years ago, I was driving home from a friend's house. Since I lived in a rural area, I often drove to town to hang out with friends. I can't remember exactly what we were doing that night, but we usually went bowling, watched a movie, or just grabbed some ice cream and hung out at the park. However, I do remember that we lost track of time, and by the time I started driving home, it was after midnight. My house was about 5 miles from the highway, and 5 miles of dark dirt roads at night, so it could be quite eerie. It's amazing how dark it gets. If the lights go out, you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I was about half a mile from the highway when my headlights illuminated a man walking along the side of the road. He was tall and burly, with a mustache and an old baseball hat. I was surprised to see him because there aren't many people in the area, so it helps to have that extra time if you need to stop for a deer or avoid a pothole. I was in my late 30s, and he seemed to be in his late 30s, but he didn't seem threatening, so I was so trusting. I slowed down, and he approached the driver's side window. "Howdy, ma'am," he said. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but could I trouble you for a ride into town?" I didn't hesitate and said, "Yeah, thanks very much. I really appreciate it." He said graciously, "Well, you're welcome. Ricky, my name is Sheila." I turned the vehicle around and drove back to the highway since, as I said, we were only half a mile in at that time, so it wasn't a huge thing to offer him a ride. He responded, innocuous as it seems, but he was so kind that I couldn't help but believe him. We spoke for a few minutes, and despite the fact that I was alone in a vehicle with a stranger, his cool attitude put me at ease. However, after 10 or so minutes, he said, "I'm really sorry to have to do this, ma'am, but I'm going to need to take your car." When he took out a revolver and aimed it directly at me, I sat there startled and incredulous, trying to understand what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" I implored. "Like I said, I need to take the car. Let's not make this difficult." My heart almost stopped as I saw the true regret on his face for what he was doing. I stopped the vehicle and got out, "Ricky," and he grabbed the wheel. "One more thing, ma'am, I need your phone." "I can't have you contacting the cops on me," he said, adding that I simply gave him my phone without saying anything. We drove to the police station to file a report, and the officer informed me that my description matched that of a man who was wanted for several armed robberies in this and the surrounding towns. It was Ricky, who had been waiting for someone to pass by so he could take advantage of their goodwill. My entire body was shaking, and he apologized before driving off into the night. I walked for about 30 minutes before I was able to flag down a police car. I was that unlucky person. It really messed with my mind to have such a polite and friendly person turn on me in the blink of an eye. I've always been someone who tries to help others, but this made me question my entire worldview. Why should I put myself at risk for someone who might mean me harm? That's a decision we all need to make for ourselves. I don't want to give up on the world or anything, but it's just something to think about. Stay safe out there, and watch out for strangers. In September 2020, I went on a trip to Germany where most of my family and friends live except for those in California. Not to brag, but my family is incredibly wealthy, much wealthier than I can even express. In fact, my uncle is a billionaire. Because of this, I had my own personal supercar, a 2020 Lamborghini Aventador SV in Germany. I have one back in the US too. My cousins, who are also extremely wealthy, were in Germany at the same time. We decided to go for a drive on the German Abend with our supercars. For those Unfamiliar, the Autobahn is a highway in Germany with no speed limit. The group consisted of me and my cousins David, Luke, and Werner. David drove a Ferrari SF90, Luke had his Porsche 918, and Werner was in his McLaren 720s. We started our drive around 8 p.m. Before we knew it, we were going over 160 miles per hour. I was enjoying the ride when I noticed something wasn't right. David was missing from the group. I looked around to confirm, but to my horror, he was nowhere to be seen. I called my cousins and asked them to pull over. When I told them what had happened, they were just as confused and terrified as I was. There was no way David could have disappeared so suddenly at such high speed. I kept trying to call him, but he wasn't answering. In a desperate attempt, we did something risky to find David. We reversed our vehicles and drove in the other way. When we arrived at the location where David was last seen, we parked and went into the neighboring woods along the Autobahn. Less than 3 minutes later, I heard cries for help. It was David's voice. We ran towards the sound, but to our horror, no matter how fast we ran, the cries remained the same distance away from us. It was as though David, or whatever was mimicking his voice, was moving away from us while still screaming for help. We panicked, screaming and crying in frustration. We searched endlessly, but we couldn't find him. With tears streaming down our faces, we called Luke's parents, who were just as terrified as we were. They contacted the police, and we waited until they arrived. A massive search party was organized and continued for 3 days. What was strange, however, was that David's Ferrari showed no signs of any crash or incident. It was perfectly intact, not a scratch or missing item inside except for David. Everything was untouched. The search continued, but after a solid year, the case was closed. No one could explain how this had happened, unless it was some sort of glitch in the Matrix or something equally unimaginable. Now in 2022, I still miss and mourn my dear cousin. His car was returned to us, and sometimes I drive it around holding on to hope that he's okay, or at least alive and somehow waiting to be found. This incident has haunted me, making every bone in my body shiver. As unbelievable as it may sound, it is true, and yet it remains deeply unsettling. This happened when I was in my early 20s. It was the year 2003, and I was working as a taxi driver at the time. It was a job I held for several years while finishing my education. I mostly worked the late shift because it fit my schedule. After dropping off my last passenger on my way home, I drove through a new housing development along my route. I had passed through it a few times before. The size of the unfinished houses indicated a significant investment had been made in the area. During the day, the place was busy with construction workers and landscapers, but at nearly 2 a.m., all that remained were piles of lumber and lifeless. I felt a spooky feeling as I slowly moved through the construction site. There was a sign that read "Slow for Workers," but I wasn't sure if it applied at night. I chose to follow it anyway because I didn't want to risk getting a ticket as I passed a big dump truck. Other signs of the neighborhood's exclusivity included the neighborhood's border with a forest. A guy was momentarily lit by my headlights, and before I could respond, he raced up to my window. He was clearly scared, so I immediately locked my doors and made sure my windows were up. As he got close to the driver's side window, I could see that he was a clean-cut man, probably in his mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt, blue jeans, and tennis shoes. Despite his complete terror, tears were streaming down his face, and his whole body trembled. He stood by my car, his words muffled and incomprehensible through my closed windows. Perhaps I should have driven away, but something in his desperation made me listen to him speak. "Please, sir, let me in. I have money," he begs. "I have money. I have money." A part of me wanted to assist at that moment, but we were all alone out there, and his urgent eagerness made me nervous. The guy implored, "What's coming?" I questioned, bewildered, and there wasn't time to explain. He sobbed. After a restless night, I called the police station to see if he had been found. They told me that they had sent 2 patrol cars to the location where I saw him, but nothing was there. I felt a little relieved that he had either found another ride or that my suspicions that he had bad intentions had been correct. Most taxi drivers have stories about passengers they shouldn't have picked up assaults. I decided not to let him and hold on. "I'll call the police for you." I told him no, there was no time. He insisted as I drove away, and I could hear him yelling, "Please," as he ran after my car. I drove straight to the police station and told them what had happened, and I followed their advice. A few days later, I saw a news report about a body discovered in a forest close to where I had met the man. They showed a picture of the victim, who was the man who had pleaded for my help. The reporter said that the cause of death was an animal attack, but I don't think that's true because there were no animals larger than raccoons in that forest. I clearly remember him saying that he was chasing me. If it had been an animal, he would have mentioned it. The guilt of abandoning someone in need weighed heavily on me, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. One of the most terrifying questions is whether it is still out there. This is a true story of mine that happened one night after finishing work at around 11 p.m. Around 10 p.m., I left a fast food restaurant on the other side of town from my house. The journey took about 45 minutes, which seemed lengthy for the little pay I was making. Since I couldn't find another work, I did this. It began to rain, and by the time I left work at 11 o'clock, the roads were slick and wet. I drove cautiously for the first part of the trip because visibility was poor due to the rain. The route I took was mostly through rural areas where the roads turned into unpaved paths, so I increased my speed a little because I was tired and just wanted to get home and go to bed. Suddenly, I saw red brake lights ahead of me, so I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late, and I collided with the back of a car that was turning onto one of the country roads. I knew I was at fault even though I had slowed down, because it is well known that if you hit someone from behind, the blame falls on you. Fortunately, I was unharmed because I was able to reduce my speed before the impact, but my mind was racing with thoughts of how much this was going to cost me. I was not making much money at the time, so I pulled my car to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and wiped a tear from my cheek before going outside to check the damage. I saw that my car had a big dent and a broken headlight, which I knew would cost at least a few $100s to fix, but it could have been worse. Next, I looked at the other car that had pulled over in front of me. The driver hadn't yet come out, so I waited between the 2 cars as the rain continued to fall. I expected to be yelled at, and I felt like I deserved it. About 30 seconds later, the other car's front door opened, and a guy wearing blue trousers and a gray hooded sweatshirt emerged. He seemed to be in his 40s. He walked to the back of his car to check the damage, which seemed to be about the same as on my car, a broken tail light and a large dent, and then he looked up and approached me. I also noticed a handgun strapped to his hip, which was unusual where I lived, but seeing a fire weapon did add an extra layer of tension to the situation. He told me I was young, but I knew that if someone was hurt in an accident, you have to report it to the police because any trouble I was in would be much worse if I didn't report it. I said I'm going to call this in because it was my fault. I don't remember exactly what he said at the time, but he tried to talk me out of reporting the accident. I took out my phone to dial 911. I realized I had really messed up when I noticed a small trail of blood dripping down his face, which I assumed was from the accident. "It looks like just a scratch, buddy." His attitude changed at that point. He appeared irate and started to approach me. He wasn't explicitly threatening, but he was encroaching on my personal space and displaying dominance, which added to the tension. I immediately decided not to call, put my phone back in my pocket, and the man immediately backed down before getting back into his car. I stood there for a while, still in shock over what had happened, but as he was leaving, I remembered his license plate. I won't say what it was, but I repeated it to myself several times until it vanished into the distance. After that, I went back to my car and dialed the police. It was after midnight when I arrived, and I was exhausted, but I knew how important it was to get that guy off the streets, so I went and did my best to help the investigation in any way I could. I told them that I had been in a car accident where the other driver was hurt, but he adamantly refused to call the police. They took the situation seriously, and when I gave them the license plate number, they ran it through their system and discovered that the car had been stolen a few days earlier and used in an armed robbery. That's when I realized why the man didn't want to call the police. The damage to my car cost about $250, which I paid out of pocket. I was never charged for the damage to the other car, though I suppose the rightful owner could come after me for it. Either way, money didn't matter. What was important was getting that dangerous man off the streets. If I had been more persistent about calling the police, I have no doubt he would have done something worse. Something really scary happened to me when I was about 18 years old back in the early 1990s. I was really into cars back then, and I enjoyed working on mine. Even though I was a girl, I had a 1979 Z28 Camaro with T-tubs. In the summer, I would go cruising with my friends looking for something to do. One evening, while driving up and down the main street of a nearby city, I noticed a small red truck following us from a distance. I was with my friend Jenny, and I mentioned that I thought the truck might be following us. I pulled into the driveway of a fast food restaurant, and the truck followed, staying 3 car lengths behind. I drove out in the opposite direction, and again the truck followed. I pulled into another driveway, and the truck did the same. I repeated this several times, and the truck kept following us, always staying 3 car lengths back. Jenny and I decided to head toward home, which was about 30 minutes away. We thought the driver of the truck would eventually give up and let us go, but he didn't. He just kept following. It was getting late, and we were becoming increasingly worried because the truck had been following us for almost an hour. We didn't want to go home and let him follow us there. I decided the best thing to do would be to drive to the nearest police station. I told Jenny what I was planning, and to my horror, she grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it sharply to the right. "Where you doing, Scree? You're going to make us crash." It was bad enough that I had to worry about the truck following us, but now I had to worry about my passenger panicking and causing an accident. "No, we can't go to the police," she insisted. Then it occurred to me she somehow thought we were at fault. She believed that just cruising around had provoked the truck. Reluctantly, I drove away from the police station. As we approached a bridge, we stopped for red light on the one-way street. The truck was directly behind the car next to us. That car turned right, allowing the truck to pull forward. When I looked over, I was startled to discover that the driver had exited his vehicle without any pants, not even down to his ankles. He wasn't wearing any pants at all. I had the disturbing feeling that he may have been following us without any pants the entire time. I hit the gas pedal and ran the red light, speeding over the bridge. Somehow Jenny didn't see him when I told her. She just kept saying no way. I drove up and down a few more streets and back over the bridge, then into the country. The truck followed us for what felt like forever until we were able to finally lose him by driving really fast into the middle of nowhere. We went home and tried to forget about it. For some reason I never told my parents, and I'm not sure why. A few weeks later I saw on the news that the police were searching for a man in a small red truck. They showed his picture and it resembled the man I saw following us. I thought their description of the truck was slightly different from the one we saw, but maybe not. I've always wondered if it was him. When I was 16, my close friend Shayla and I were driving home from a visit with my distant family in West Michigan. At the time I lived in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was 11 p.m. and we were the only ones on the road. I had never taken this route before, but I wanted to avoid the toll roads this time, so we decided to try it out. Shayla and I were so engrossed in our talk that we failed to see that we were approaching an abandoned town. When I realized what was happening, a horrible sensation crept in my stomach. My companion saw that I was uncomfortable and asked if I was well. I said, "Yes, I'm fine," but it was a lie. The town was eerie, with shuttered stores, old houses with boarded-up windows, and even abandoned cars and trucks. It truly looked like a scene from a horror film. We remained silent, the air getting colder with a sense of foreboding, and after a few minutes my car started to shake, and I realized we were running low on gas. I pulled over in front of another abandoned house, which was a great place to break down. Shayla joked nervously, and I nodded, agreeing with her sarcastic remark. I took out my phone and attempted to call roadside assistance, which my parents had programmed into my contacts, but I discovered we had no cell reception. I had completely forgotten to stop at a station miles back in a different town. When Shayla and I got out of the car to try to get service, things started to feel weird. I was concentrating on trying to get reception when Shayla suddenly grabbed my arm and whispered my name. Her eyes were wide with fear as she pointed ahead and said, "There's a man standing about 10 feet away from us." I followed her gaze and saw him, a tall man about 6 feet 2 inches, standing just out of my car's headlight range. "This town is lifeless. How can anybody be here?" I was unable to talk or breathe because my heart was thumping in my chest, but at last Shayla broke the gap. "Do you need anything?" she said, and the guy cocked his head and grinned, which just made me more afraid to move. He continued to stare at us, his smile growing. "My dad is a police officer. You are a weirdo." We sat in silence for a moment before we heard a noise coming from underneath the car. Shayla screamed and cried as I tried to remain composed. He yelled in a panic that was an error, and his expression changed to one of rage. He started to move toward us quickly, and adrenaline shot through me as we ran back into the car and locked the doors. We looked out the window, but he was gone, confused. Would my phone be able to obtain service? I finally got 2 bars, so I called the police and told them what had happened. They said they would be there in 20 minutes, which seemed like an eternity considering the circumstances, but we were stuck in the middle of nowhere, so we waited. When the call ended, the noise stopped, and I stayed on high alert, trembling with fear. I gave Shayla a tight hug as we sobbed, and her face went cold as she looked behind me toward the back window. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't help but look. The man was back with 4 other people. We heard police sirens and felt a wave of relief as a police car approached. I had never been so happy to see an officer before, and by the time he got to my car, the people had vanished, shaken. 2 men and 2 women were standing behind our car, and they all gave us smiles that chilled us to the bone. I was unable to tell the police what had transpired. Shayla took over telling them everything. They offered to get us gas, but instead I begged them to take us to a hotel in a populated area and call my parents to come get us. To this day, the police have never found those people, and we've never figured out where they could have come from. My guess is that they lived in one of the abandoned buildings. I hope they block off that town someday, and I'll never take that back way again. This happened just a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin James. The first was 13 and James was 21. We were driving from our grandmother's house to our aunt's house. I have a close relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. The drive was about 10 hours, and we were 3 hours into it. It was 9:00 p.m. at the time, and I was quite tired, but everything seemed funny. When I saw a red Semmet outside my window, I burst into laughter. The man driving the truck was heavy set with a long wild beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I still waved at him. In response, he did a strange groping motion toward me. I found it more amusing than scary, so I laughed even harder and told James the story while mimicking the motion. James looked disgusted, but there wasn't much either of us could do. A while later, about 4.5 hours into the drive, James pulled into a rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was standing there. He appeared to be at least 6 feet tall. I glanced up a glass door leading into the building and saw James glaring at him through the glass. I was confused, so I walked back to the car. What James told me next really creeped me out, especially after being awake for around 20 hours. The man had been staring at me and followed me into the building, mumbling. I was crying uncontrollably when James walked out and yelled at the man, threatening him. The man backed off, got back into his truck, and continued to stare at me with that grin. We quickly drove away, wanting nothing to do with him. It was around 12 a.m. when we pulled into a motel to sleep, and the rest of the night until 8 a.m. was uneventful. James told me he was talking normally, but he had to use the restroom. A few seconds later, when I was inside the car, the man was at my window once more, and he began to treat me well. We were eating breakfast at a restaurant the following morning when the same guy sat across from us. He smiled at me, and I turned to face James, who was furious. The man passed our table on his way to the restroom and touched my shoulder, then did the same on his way back, and James and I knew it wasn't an accident. James was usually late returning, but since he had known me since I was a baby, he was very protective. At that point, James couldn't contain his nerves and got up from his seat to go to the man's table. He yelled at him to leave us alone and back off, but he didn't threaten me. Instead, he cursed a lot. I felt very anxious and wanted to leave. The man got up and slapped James, then said that I had been leading him on. Their argument went on, and the police were called. After hearing this story, they decided that we could file charges because James had been assaulted, but James declined, so we continued our day without seeing the man again. A month ago, I was moving, and after the moving truck was loaded, I fell asleep in it. An hour or two later, I woke up in a town close to my new home, where my grandmother had parked at a Burger King, and I was still asleep when my 19-year-old cousin, Max, came to the passenger door and woke me up to help carry the food. I agreed, and we entered the Burger King. I am 14 years old, and I am fairly small. I am only 5 feet tall and weigh 100 pounds. We left Burger King as I sat in the moving truck sipping a chocolate milkshake and Max ordered. I tapped her arm to say I was going to the bathroom, and when I got back, I noticed an older man, possibly in his mid-50s or early 60s, staring at Max and then at me. I didn't pay much attention to it because I was still pretty groggy. I walked back to Max as she struggled to get a soda from one of the machines, and after a while she eventually got the soda. He stopped at the driver's side where my grandmother was, and she looked perplexed. "Who am I?" he asked, in the same serious tone, and then he began talking about taking care of us girls. I was scared, and memories of scary things I had read on Reddit suddenly came flooding back. He pointed at me and said, "You're a pain in the ass." I started laughing awkwardly and mumbled something, but he kept talking until I heard Max calling me and saying that I had left my fries in the bag, even though I had them with me. To fully understand the significance of this story, you need to know a little bit about me. I went over to ask her what she meant, but she quickly changed the topic to the man. After about 5 minutes, we both agreed that he was giving off creepy vibes. My grandmother then called my name to say we were leaving, but his car was in our way. He got into his car and moved out of the way. "I'm watching you," hand gesture and mouthing the words. I then grabbed my phone and called Max to make sure he didn't follow us. Fortunately, he didn't, but it still creeps me to think that he was watching us while we got our food and drinks. My early years were influenced by the 1960s and early 1970s in a small town in upstate Ohio, where there was only one stoplight at Broadway in Maine and about 40 businesses grouped in the town center. The neighborhood drugstore, soda shop, hardware store, and small grocery store were all located on one corner. I was born in 1954. Ben Franklin's, a barber shop, a gas station, a library, a post office, and a jail. The jail was set up so that you could easily get past the desk officer 9 times out of 10 and see who was inside. We never asked why anyone was there. Instead, we would run errands or bring those cigarettes if they were locked up. A few years later came the assassination of JFK, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam protests, and the hippie revolution, of which I became a part. I joined the early wave of hippies, hitchhiking across the United States and Canada for more than 3 years. My mother was not happy with this lifestyle, but I went along without money, clothes, or worries. Many people warned me about the dangers, but I disregarded their advice because I felt invincible and naive. In June 1969, when I was 14 years old, I spent the night at my friend Dina's house in a nearby town. I persuaded her to accompany me to San Francisco, where her brother lived. We crossed a cow pasture to the highway and hitched a ride, and it never took long to find one. One particularly memorable ride was on a band's tour bus bound for Chicago. We passed on that ride and carried on with our journey. Another ride took us into a Cadillac with 4 black men who were going to a party in the black area of Columbus, Ohio. We were the only white people there, but we had a great time. A nice woman even gave me a shirt, which I now realize was an attempt to hide the fact that we were a bit of a spectacle. Later, we picked up a lone hitchhiker who kept warning the driver about the trouble we could get into crossing state lines. I became agitated and told him to stop, but we didn't. The driver stopped in Iowa for gas, and as Dina and I went to freshen up, we found police waiting for us. Our parents were probably informed, but I don't recall that part. We stayed in a hotel in Reno, which was dull compared to what we expected, and after a brief stay, Dina's mother drove all the way to pick us up. We then traveled the remaining 1,900 miles to California. The trip was unforgettable, and I sang along to the radio the entire way through Nevada, especially remembering the song Mama and Papa about going to San Francisco. Despite my small-town cool, I felt out of place and unprepared for the harsh realities like drug addiction, which I witnessed firsthand at Needle Park, where I saw people strung out on drugs. Other experiences left me deeply shaken, and I wanted to go home and never return to California. I tried to persuade Dina to leave, but she refused, and I now realize how selfish that would have been. We continued to San Francisco, landing near Berkeley College and Haight-Ashbury, where the hippie scene was vibrant. Months later, back in Ohio at home, it was July, and the news was full of stories about the Manson family and their infamous killings. It was then that I realized how close I had been to being picked up by them. What if Dina and her mother hadn't been there to accompany me? What if that driver hadn't turned us into the police in Iowa? I shuddered to think what might have happened if I had been out there alone or farther away from help. I later found out that the Manson family actively recruited from Haight-Ashbury, where we spent a lot of time. I'm glad I wasn't enmeshed in that dark world, especially considering how vulnerable I was in California at the time. I recall those nights so clearly. Even though it was over 12 years ago, I was a teenager hanging out with friends at my buddy's house. We were playing video games and messing around like teenagers do, but as the night went on, it was time for everyone to head home. It was my turn to drive, and I brought my mom's minivan for the occasion. My favorite part was getting to look cool while driving. I wore some stylish sunglasses even though it was nighttime. I was happy to help out and spend a little extra time with my friends. The first 3 were dropped off without incident, but then it was Alton's turn. I knew Alton lived in a remote area, though I had no idea how far it was because I'd never been there before. We drove down a long winding road covered in gravel with forest on either side. It was so dark I could barely see the road ahead. I drove slowly because my headlights didn't shine very far even with the high beams on. After what felt like a long time, we arrived at Alton's house. It was a small, simple house hidden away in the woods. He thanked me and hopped out of the minivan. I turned around and began the long drive back. I was nervous about the return journey, mainly because it was so dark and remote. I paid close attention to every turn we had taken, repeating them in my head to make sure I wouldn't get lost. I was about halfway back to the main road when something caught my eye. There was a man standing by the side of the road. At first I thought he might be a hitchhiker, but that alone was strange because there was hardly any traffic at that hour. As I got closer, he disappeared into the woods. I felt really scared and confused. It didn't make sense to see someone walking alone, especially that far out at night. I eventually made it home and tried to forget about the strange man. It wasn't until the next day that I found out something terrible had happened. I was hanging out with my friends again and told them about what I had seen that night. Someone mentioned that one of Alton's neighbors had gone missing. I listened with fear as they continued to talk. I was convinced it had to be connected to what I had seen. The thought made my skin crawl. We called the police right then and there. I explained that I had been in the area and saw a strange man on the road. In the middle of the night, the police told me to come into the station. I went in and gave a more detailed account of what I saw. I tried to gather more information about the case out of curiosity, but they said it was confidential. Fair enough, I suppose. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, but in the end, there really wasn't anything more I could do. What could I have done? Stopped my vehicle and after the guy into the dark woods. The police spent days searching the area, paying particular attention to the location where I had seen the man, but they were unable to find anything. After a few years, Alton's neighbor never came back, and I nearly forgot about the whole thing. The case must have died cold because I hadn't heard anything for a while, until one day I was watching the news and saw that Alton's neighbor's body had been found, but it was more than 50 miles away in a different part of the woods than where I had seen the man. There's no way to know for sure, but I suspect something sinister was going on those roads that night. I still can't stop thinking about that night and wondering whether it was him I saw on the road. Did he relocate the corpse to a different location because he knew I had seen him? This happened on a warm night, and in September 2013 I noticed the full moon as I drove down a deserted road. My headlights cut through the thick fog that had settled over the city. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and I was looking forward to a quiet night at home, but fate had other plans for me. As I rounded the bend in the road, I saw two cars pulled over to the side. They were illuminated by the glow of a street light. As I got closer, I saw that there was a man being held at gunpoint by another man. I slowed as I passed. The victim was trembling and pleading with the gunman, but he was relentless in his demands for money and valuables. They didn't even seem to notice me at first. Perhaps all the commotion was distraction enough for me to go unnoticed. My hands began to shake on the wheel as I realized I was witnessing a crime in progress. I knew I had to act quickly, so I backed my car into a dark section of the road and fumbled for my phone in my pocket. I dropped it on the floor of my car, my eyes still fixated on the robbery. I reached down for my phone, not wanting to look away. I finally found it and dialed 911. Then I watched in horror as the gunman turned towards me. Until then I thought I was well hidden by the darkness, but I was wrong. I quickly hit the gas and sped away, praying that he wouldn't follow me. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel as I drove for a few minutes, telling the police what I had just seen. When I finally pulled over to the side of the road, my phone rang, and it was the police. I didn't know how long they were on the line, but I assumed they would have heard me, only my labored breathing and perhaps a few mild expletives. When I answered the phone, the officer informed me that someone was on their way and would be there shortly. I hung up knowing that I had done the right thing by calling for help. But as I waited for the police to arrive, I noticed a car pull up behind me. At first, I thought it was the gunman because it looked like one of the ones I had seen before, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The driver had gotten out and was pacing back and forth behind his car as if he was waiting for something, so I locked my doors and kept a close eye on him. Just as I was about to call the police again, I noticed flashing lights in the distance, and I felt relieved that the cavalry had finally arrived. I assumed that if the other man had been the shooter, he would have left by now, so I felt a bit more at ease. But if he wasn't, then who was he? I watched through my rearview mirror as both police officers approached the other driver, who had stopped pacing and was now standing quietly by his car. Suddenly, the driver fled and ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The police chased after him, but he was too quick and elusive, and for several hours they searched the area, combing through the woods and checking nearby houses, but he had disappeared. Only more questions remained after a trace. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. I knew that I had done the right thing by calling the police, but I also knew that I had put myself in danger by getting involved at all. Despite the risks, I would do it all over again. The following day, I received a call from the police informing me that they had identified the driver and that he had a lengthy criminal history. They thanked me for reporting the crime and for being observant, which helped catch a dangerous criminal.